In May 1943, Hans Müller, a 22-year-old private in the German Afrika Korps, crouched in a foxhole near Tunis, his Mauser rifle slick with sweat. The air vibrated with the rumble of Allied tanks, and the horizon glowed orange from artillery fire. Hans, raised in a small Bavarian village, had believed in the Führer's promises of a swift victory. Nazi propaganda painted Americans as soft, undisciplined, and culturally inferior, a nation of cowboys and gangsters who would crumble against German discipline. But as British and American forces closed in, Hans's unit surrendered, their ammunition spent. He expected execution or torture. As his officers had warned, the Americans show no mercy to prisoners. Instead, a sunburned American sergeant offered him water and a cigarette, speaking in broken German. "You're safe now, Fritz. War's over for you." Hans's journey began with a disorienting voyage across the Atlantic on a cramped Liberty ship, surrounded by 500 other German POWs. They whispered rumors of American cruelty, expecting starvation or forced labor. In June 1943, the ship docked in New York Harbor. Hans pressed against a porthole, stunned by the Manhattan skyline, skyscrapers taller than anything in Berlin, glittering under electric lights. "This cannot be the primitive America we were told about," he muttered to his bunkmate, Klaus, a wiry Berliner. The POWs were herded onto a train, their wrists bound, but the guards handed out sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, white bread, ham, and cheese, more food than Hans had seen in months. The train chugged west, through endless fields of wheat and corn, past factories belching smoke and small towns with neat wooden houses. Hans stared at the landscape, so different from Germany's war-torn cities. In Concordia, Kansas, the train stopped, and the prisoners marched to Camp Concordia, a sprawling facility with barbed wire and watchtowers. Hans braced for a gulag, but found rows of wooden barracks with glass windows, electric lights, and flush toilets, luxuries rare in his village. The mess hall served hot coffee, eggs, and bacon, a stark contrast to the watery soup of his military rations. "Is this a trick?" Klaus whispered, eyeing the food suspiciously. Hans, too, felt unease. Why would the enemy treat them so well? Their first day, Captain John Reynolds, the camp commander, addressed the prisoners in halting German. "You are prisoners of war, but under the Geneva Convention, you will be treated humanely. Work is voluntary, and you'll have access to education and recreation." Hans didn't believe it. Nazi officers had claimed the Geneva Convention was Allied propaganda. Yet, as he settled into his bunk, he noticed a small library in the barracks, books in German and English, from Goethe to Hemingway. A radio played American jazz, forbidden in Germany as degenerate. Hans, who had played violin in his village church, felt a pang of curiosity. Could a nation with such music be as barbaric as he'd been taught? That night, Hans lay awake, replaying the day. The abundance, food, electricity, even the friendly nods from guards, challenged everything he knew. He whispered to Klaus, "If America is this rich, how can we win this war?" Klaus scoffed, loyal to the Reich, but Hans's mind raced. The America he'd been taught to despise was not the one he was seeing. By July 1943, Hans adjusted to the rhythm of Camp Concordia. The camp housed 4,000 German POWs, mostly Afrika Korps veterans, in a facility designed for comfort under Geneva Convention rules. Each barracks had running water, electric heaters, and bunk beds with clean linens. The mess hall offered 3 meals daily: meat, potatoes, fresh vegetables, and desserts like apple pie, which Hans found absurdly decadent. "In Munich, my mother queues for hours for a loaf of bread," he told Klaus, who remained skeptical, muttering about American tricks to weaken our resolve. Hans volunteered for work, partly to escape boredom, partly to test the Americans' intentions. He joined a crew harvesting wheat on a nearby farm, under loose supervision by armed but relaxed guards. The farmer, Mr. Thompson, a grizzled Kansan, greeted them in overalls, offering lemonade. Hans, expecting hostility, was stunned when Thompson asked about his hometown. "Bavaria sounds pretty, like our Ozarks," Thompson said through a translator. Hans, hesitant, described his village's rolling hills and church festivals, surprised by the farmer's genuine interest. The work was hard but fair, and the POWs earned 80 cents a day, real money, which they could spend at the camp canteen on cigarettes, candy, or writing paper. Back at camp, Hans explored the recreation programs. The Americans provided soccer fields, a theater for German-language plays, and classes in English, history, and even agriculture. Hans enrolled in an English class taught by Miss Eleanor Hayes, a young schoolteacher from Concordia. Her patience disarmed him. "Why do you teach us the enemy?" he asked one day, his English halting. Eleanor smiled. "You're not my enemy, Hans. You're just a young man caught in a war." Her words lingered, clashing with the Nazi rhetoric of total war against a dehumanized foe. The camp's library became Hans's refuge. He read Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, struggling with the English, but captivated by its humor and humanity. A German translation of The Grapes of Wrath stunned him with its depiction of American struggles during the Depression, yet also the resilience of its people. "How can a nation write so honestly about its flaws?" he asked Klaus, who dismissed the books as propaganda. Hans wasn't so sure. The America he was discovering, through literature, music, and casual chats with guards, felt complex, not the caricature of Nazi propaganda. One evening, a guard, Sergeant Mike Kowalski, a Polish-American from Chicago, invited Hans to listen to a baseball game on the radio. Hans, unfamiliar with the sport, was intrigued by Mike's enthusiasm. "This is America, Hans, freedom, competition, a chance to start over," Mike said, tossing him a baseball. Hans caught it, feeling the leather's weight, a symbol of a culture he was beginning to understand. But doubt gnawed at him. Was he betraying Germany by finding value in his enemy's ways? By autumn 1943, Hans's worldview began to crack. The camp's newspaper, the Concordia Chronicle, printed in German, included war updates, Allied victories in Italy, Soviet advances in the East. Hans, raised on Goebbels's promises of German invincibility, felt unease. "They're lying to break our spirit," Klaus insisted. But Hans noticed the articles cited verifiable details, unlike the vague boasts of Nazi radio. He began to suspect the war wasn't going as Germany claimed. Interactions with Americans deepened his doubts. During a farm work detail, Hans met Mrs. Thompson, the farmer's wife, who brought homemade cookies to the POWs. "My son's fighting in Italy," she said softly. "I pray he's treated as well as you are here." Her kindness stunned Hans, who had been taught Americans hated Germans. He mumbled thanks, his face burning with shame for the hatred he'd once held. In English class, Eleanor introduced a re-education program, part of the U.S. War Department's effort to expose POWs to democratic ideals. She showed a film about American elections, explaining how citizens chose leaders. Hans, raised under Hitler's one-party state, was skeptical. "People can't be trusted to vote wisely," he argued, echoing Nazi ideology. Eleanor countered gently, "Democracy isn't perfect, Hans, but it gives everyone a voice." Her words echoed in his mind during sleepless nights, challenging his belief in Germany's superior system. A fellow POW, Otto, a former teacher from Dresden, became Hans's confidant. Older and more reflective, Otto shared Hans's doubts. "We were told America was weak, chaotic," Otto said, gesturing at the camp's orderly facilities. "But look at this place, built in months, feeding thousands. What if we were lied to?" Hans resisted, loyal to his upbringing. But the evidence was undeniable. America's wealth, organization, and humanity contradicted everything he'd been taught. One night, Hans overheard guards discussing the Holocaust, rumors of camps where Jews and others were being exterminated. He dismissed it as Allied propaganda, but Otto's grim expression gave him pause. "If they're lying about America, Hans, what else might they be lying about?" Otto asked. Hans couldn't answer, his faith in the Reich shaken by the reality around him. Winter 1943 brought new experiences. The camp organized a Christmas celebration with a tree, carols, and gifts for POWs, socks, books, and chocolate. Hans, who hadn't celebrated Christmas since leaving home, was moved by the gesture. Sergeant Kowalski invited him to join a choir singing German carols like Still Nacht. Singing alongside American guards, Hans felt a fleeting sense of unity, a stark contrast to the division preached by his leaders. Work details brought Hans closer to Concordia's civilians. He and Otto helped repair a local church damaged by a storm, working alongside townsfolk. A teenager, Tommy, asked Hans about German music, sharing his love for Glenn Miller swing. Hans admitted he'd never heard it, banned in Germany. Tommy snuck him a record, and that night, Hans listened in the barracks, the upbeat rhythm clashing with his memories of martial anthems. This is what they fight for, he thought, a life of joy, not just duty. Eleanor's classes grew more personal. She shared letters from her brother, a soldier in the Pacific, describing his hopes for peace. Hans, emboldened, shared stories of his village festivals, finding common ground in family and tradition. "We're not so different," Eleanor said, smiling. Hans nodded, but guilt gnawed at him. Was he betraying his comrades by befriending the enemy? A letter from his mother in Bavaria arrived, describing food shortages and air raids. "We pray for your survival in American hands," she wrote, assuming he was suffering. Hans stared at the letter, his stomach full from a camp meal of roast beef and mashed potatoes. The contrast was unbearable. He began writing back, struggling to describe his life without alarming her. "The Americans treat us well," he wrote cautiously, knowing censors would read it. By spring 1944, Hans volunteered at the camp hospital, assisting Dr. William Carter, a local physician. The hospital's X-ray machines and penicillin shocked Hans, who had seen German field hospitals struggle with basic supplies. Dr. Carter, noticing his interest, explained, "We share what we have, even with prisoners." Hans wondered if Germany would do the same for Allied POWs, a question that haunted him. In June 1944, news of D-Day electrified the camp. The Concordia Chronicle reported Allied landings in Normandy, and Hans sensed the war shifting. Klaus, still loyal, insisted Germany would counterattack, but Hans saw fear in his eyes. The camp's radio broadcasts, which Hans now understood in English, detailed German retreats. He began to accept the Reich might lose. Work on farms continued, and Hans grew close to the Thompsons. Mr. Thompson shared news of his son's death in Italy, his voice steady but eyes wet. "I don't blame you, Hans," he said. "War's bigger than any of us." Hans, who had lost a brother at Stalingrad, felt a bond beyond nationality. He offered condolences, his German formalities softened by genuine sorrow. Eleanor's re-education classes intensified, discussing American history and civil rights. Hans was struck by stories of Abraham Lincoln and the abolition of slavery, concepts alien to Nazi ideology. "America fights for freedom, not just power," Eleanor said. Hans wanted to argue, but couldn't. The camp's fairness, fair wages, decent food, even a POW council, embodied those ideals. Otto shared a forbidden newspaper smuggled from a guard, detailing Nazi atrocities. Hans read about concentration camps, his stomach churning. "This can't be true," he said, but Otto's silence spoke volumes. Hans's belief in Germany's moral superiority crumbled, replaced by a growing admiration for America's openness. By summer, Hans joined a camp orchestra, playing violin in concerts for POWs and locals. Performing Bach alongside American folk tunes, he felt music bridge the gap between enemies. A local woman, Mrs. Larson, clapped warmly, saying, "You play like my son used to." Her kindness, like so many others, chipped away at Hans's prejudices. By late 1944, Hans faced a moral reckoning. Newsreels shown in the camp theater depicted German cities in ruins, civilians starving. Hans's letters from home grew desperate. His mother described Dresden's destruction, his sister's hunger. Yet at Concordia, he ate better than ever, lived in comfort, and learned from people who treated him as human. The contrast felt like betrayal. Dr. Carter invited Hans to assist with a surgery, trusting his steady hands. Afterward, Hans asked, "Why help us when your people die fighting us?" Carter replied, "Healing doesn't pick sides. It's what makes us civilized." Hans thought of Nazi propaganda glorifying conquest over compassion and felt ashamed. Eleanor's classes now included discussions of post-war rebuilding. Germany will need people like you, Hans, she said, to create a new future. Hans was torn. He loved his homeland, but saw its flaws clearly now. America, with its flaws and freedoms, offered a vision of what Germany could become. But could he abandon his family? Christmas 1944 was bittersweet. The camp celebration included gifts and a feast, but Hans's thoughts were with his family, likely starving. He wrote a letter he couldn't send, confessing his admiration for America and his shame at Germany's lies. Otto, reading it, nodded. We've seen the truth, Hans. What we do with it matters. Rumors of Nazi death camps grew undeniable, with smuggled photos showing skeletal prisoners. Hans, horrified, confronted Klaus, who dismissed it as lies. You're becoming one of them, Klaus spat. Hans didn't argue. He was changing, and it terrified him. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. The camp erupted in mixed emotions, relief among guards, despair among POWs. Hans listened to the radio, hearing of Hitler's death and Berlin's fall. Klaus wept, but Hans felt numb. The Germany he'd fought for no longer existed. A new figure, Professor Margaret Klein, an academic studying POW re-education, arrived at Concordia. She interviewed Hans, fascinated by his transformation. You've seen America as few Germans have, she said. Could you help rebuild Germany with this perspective? Hans hesitated. He wanted to help, but the idea of returning to a broken nation overwhelmed him. Work details now included rebuilding local infrastructure, symbolizing a shift toward peace. Hans worked alongside Tommy, now a friend, on a school renovation. You could stay here, Hans, Tommy said half-jokingly. Hans smiled but felt the weight of his choice, Germany or a new life. Letters from his mother stopped, and Red Cross reports suggested his village was in ruins. Hans feared his family was dead, intensifying his crisis. Dr. Carter offered counsel. You can honor them by building a better world, here or there. Hans began to see his experience as a gift, a chance to bridge two nations. The camp's final re-education sessions focused on democracy's role in preventing war. Hans, now fluent in English, spoke up. If Germans and Americans had known each other as people, not enemies, maybe this war wouldn't have happened. Eleanor beamed, proud of his growth. In early 1946, repatriation began. Hans packed his belongings, including books and a medical kit from Dr. Carter. Professor Klein offered him a role in a post-war exchange program, teaching Germans about democracy. You could stay in America, help us understand Germany, she said. Hans was torn. His duty to his family clashed with his desire to build peace. The ship to Germany sailed from New York, and Hans stood at the rail, watching the skyline fade. Otto, beside him, said, We're not the same men who came here. Hans nodded. He'd return to Germany to find his family, if they survived, and share what he'd learned. But he vowed to return to America not as a prisoner, but as a bridge between nations. In Bremen, Hans found a shattered Germany, cities in rubble, people starving. His village was gone, but he located his mother in a refugee camp, frail but alive. The Americans didn't kill you, she wept, holding him. Hans shared his story cautiously, explaining America's humanity. We can learn from them, he said, showing her the medical kit. Hans spent a year aiding relief efforts, using his camp-acquired skills. In 1947, he joined Klein's program, returning to America as a cultural ambassador. He lectured on German Reconstruction, advocating mutual understanding. Standing before American students, violin in hand, he played a German folk tune, then a Glenn Miller song, symbolizing his dual identity. His diary, begun in Concordia, became a manuscript, published in 1948 as A Prisoner's Awakening. It detailed his journey from blind loyalty to enlightened hope, urging peace through understanding. Hans's life became a testament to the power of human connection to heal war's wounds.